Welcome. Tonight, we travel far north to medieval Norway, where winter swallowed the sun and the sky remained dark for weeks at a time. Here, above the Arctic Circle, life moved by firelight. Families gathered inside timber longhouses while snow covered the fjords and mountains stood silent beneath the polar night. Thank you for joining me on this quiet journey into the past. If you find peace in slow history and stories told gently, I'd invite you to subscribe and become part of this growing circle of listeners. Now, settle in. Let the long night begin. Imagine a place where the sun forgets to rise. Not for a day, not for a week, but for months on end. This was the reality in the far north of medieval Norway. A world locked in a long, dark winter above the Arctic Circle. Here, winter didn't just arrive. It lingered, deepened, and swallowed the sky whole. Picture this. No street lamps casting a warm glow. No friendly lights from windows across the valley. No clocks ticking away the hours. There was only the shelter of timber walls, the crackle of a central fire, and a sky that remained stubbornly dark long after morning should have come. The world grew small and silent. In scattered settlements nestled between fjords and mountains, preparation was everything. Families spent the autumn months meticulously getting ready. Fish were hung to dry in the crisp wind, meat was salted down, and wool was spun into thick, warm yarn, because once the sun dipped below the horizon for the last time, the world outside became a different place. The forest fell quiet under a heavy blanket of snow. Familiar paths vanished, and boats were frozen solid in still harbors. Inside the longhouse, the fire was the heart of everything. It was more than just warmth. It became time itself. Days were measured not in hours, but in glowing embers. The lines between day and night blurred. Children grew up in a world of shadows, where stories around the fire grew longer and the silence between words grew heavier. And yet, this was not a land of despair. It was a land of incredible endurance. Here, in the deep north, people didn't fight the darkness. They lived with it. They worked by the flickering light of oil lamps. They prayed by candlelight, and they learned to listen to the howl of the wind against their turf roofs. They were a people defined by patience, a community waiting for that first, faint return of light along the southern horizon. This is the story of medieval Norway, not in its bright summer glory, but in its longest night. It's a tale of survival beneath a sunless sky, of firelight against endless snow, and of patience measured in months. Settle in, let the darkness fall, and step with me into a world where winter ruled the calendar. And light was the most precious gift of all. In the far north of medieval Norway, there came a morning when the sun did not rise. It did not burst above the mountains in pale gold. It did not spill across the fjords in soft reflection. It did not stretch long shadows across timber walls. Instead, the sky remained a deep, unmoving blue, and then it darkened again. For those who lived above the Arctic Circle, this was not a surprise. It was a certainty, a turning of the great wheel of the year, the coming of the polar night. Long before modern science gave it a name, the people of northern Norway understood its rhythm. They did not speak of axial tilt or orbital mechanics. They spoke of seasons as living forces, of winter not as weather, but as presence. The land itself seemed to lean toward darkness. Mountains rose steep and severe, cutting the low arc of the winter sun. Fjords sliced deep into the coastline, narrow and shadowed. Forests thick with pine and birch absorbed what little light remained. Even at midday during the weeks before full polar night, the sun barely skimmed the horizon. A brief glow, a faint ember, then gone again, and eventually, not even that. When the last true sunrise passed, there was no announcement, no ceremony, only the quiet realization that the light would not return tomorrow, or the day after, or for many weeks to come. In medieval Norway, life was already shaped by isolation. Farms were scattered. Settlements were separated by water and mountain passes. Travel was difficult, even in summer. In winter, it became dangerous. Above the Arctic Circle, darkness added another layer of distance, not only from other villages, but from the sky itself. Imagine standing outside a wooden longhouse in late November. Snow has begun to gather along the roof edges. The sea lies still in the fjord. The air is sharp, thin, almost metallic in its coldness. You wait for sunrise. But instead of light climbing upward, the horizon only blushes faintly. A soft band of violet or rose that lingers for an hour or two before fading. This is twilight at noon, a suspended hour between day and night. And then, slowly, the deeper dark returns. For those who had grown up in this region, the polar night was not a horror story. It was a season like harvest or thaw, but that does not mean it was easy. Without sunlight, the body loses its oldest measure of time. There is no clear beginning to the day, no natural signal to wake, no golden reminder to rest. Time begins to blur. In medieval households, days were not divided by clocks but by tasks: feeding animals, tending fire, preparing food, mending tools. During polar night, these rhythms continued, but they took place in dimness. Firelight became the new sun. The hearth at the center of the home was more than warmth. It was orientation. It gave shape to faces. It revealed wooden beams overhead. It turned the darkness into something held at bay, if only by a few feet. Step outside that circle of glow, and the night pressed close. Yet the people did not live in constant pitch blackness. The polar night is not absolute void. Snow reflects what little light the moon and stars provide. On clear nights, the sky shimmered with cold brilliance. Constellations burned sharp and near, and sometimes the aurora. Though medieval Norwegians did not understand solar winds, they knew the dancing lights in the sky, green and white ribbons flickering above frozen fjords. Some believed them to be spirits. Others saw them as omens. Still, others simply watched in silence. In a world without artificial light, the heavens were vivid beyond modern imagination. Still, the absence of the sun changed everything. Work slowed outdoors. Boats were pulled ashore and secured. Nets were repaired inside. Animals were sheltered as best as possible. Travel between settlements decreased, unless necessity demanded it. The land entered stillness, but inside the longhouses, life compressed rather than stopped. Families gathered more closely. Space became communal. Privacy, already limited, grew rarer still. The breath of many people warmed the same air. The scent of wool, smoke, and stored food lingered heavily. And always the fire. To let it die in deep winter was dangerous. Not merely inconvenient. Dangerous. So someone remained responsible for embers through the night. A shift of awareness, even in sleep. A quiet rising to stir coals to feed the log, to protect that fragile heart of warmth against the crushing cold beyond timber walls. Outside, snow accumulated in slow layers. Roofs grew heavy. Doors stiffened. Paths disappeared. Sound itself changed, muffled by white drifts and thick air. The world felt smaller, but it also felt more intimate. Darkness has a way of narrowing attention, of drawing focus inward. When there is little to see beyond your immediate surroundings, you begin to notice details. The grain of wood, the rhythm of breath, the hiss of melting snow near the hearth, the low murmur of storytelling voices. In these months, the sky did not guide the day. Community did. And so, as the sun vanished entirely from the horizon, life did not collapse. It transformed. Children learned early that the year had two personalities, one bright and outward, the other shadowed and inward. Neither was permanent, neither was to be feared completely. The darkness was not an enemy to defeat. It was something to endure, to move through, to accept as part of the turning cycle. Weeks would pass without true daylight, but no one believed the sun was gone forever. It was only hidden somewhere beyond the curve of the world. And so they waited, not idly, but steadily. In the far north of medieval Norway, winter was not measured in calendar pages. It was measured in patience, in the steady maintenance of fire, in the careful rationing of food, in the quiet trust that what disappears will one day return. Above the mountains, the sky remained dark, but beneath timber roofs and turf-covered walls, small suns continued to burn in hearths, in lamps, and in human resolve. And so the long night began, and without mercy, yet not without meaning. Before the sky surrendered to winter, before the sun slipped below the horizon for its long absence, there was the land. In medieval Norway, the land was never simply background. It was authority. It shaped the rhythm of breath, the shape of homes, the length of journeys, and the limits of survival. To understand how people endured the endless night, you must first understand where they lived. Norway is not a flat country. It does not stretch gently beneath the sky. It rises, it folds, it fractures into mountain and water. Along its western and northern coasts, the sea carves deep corridors into stone, fjords that wind inward like quiet veins. These fjords were both protection and isolation. They shielded settlements from the open fury of the North Atlantic, but they also separated neighbors by steep cliffs and cold waters. A village across the fjord might as well have been another world in winter. Above the fjords rose mountains, sharp-backed and snow-laden for much of the year. Forests clung to lower slopes. Pine, spruce, birch. In autumn, their leaves turned gold and copper. In winter, they darkened into silhouettes against pale skies. Arable land was scarce. Farms were not large sweeping estates. They were narrow strips of cleared earth tucked between rock and water. A patch of soil here, a meadow there, carefully claimed from a landscape that resisted easy cultivation. In the medieval North, people lived not in dense cities, but in scattered farms and small coastal communities. Homes stood apart from one another, sometimes miles distant. Each household functioned almost as its own small world. Distance meant independence. It also meant vulnerability. When winter approached, families could not depend on daily help from neighbors. Snow and darkness would soon make travel uncertain. Whatever had been grown, harvested, dried, salted, or stored would have to suffice. The geography trained people to think ahead. Summers in northern Norway were brief but intense. The sun lingered long in the sky. Crops, barley, oats, hardy vegetables, grew quickly in the light-rich days. Fishing boats worked tirelessly along the coast. Cod-filled nets. Fish were split, cleaned, and hung on wooden racks too, dry and cool. Steady winds. Time moved differently in summer. There was urgency, but also abundance. Children ran across rocky shores under bright skies. Boats traveled between settlements more freely. Trade moved along the coastline, connecting even distant communities to broader networks across Scandinavia. But always, in the background of summer brightness, there was awareness. Winter would return, and in the far north, winter did not arrive gently. The first frost might seem innocent, a glitter across grass in early autumn. But as weeks passed, frost hardened into ice. Ice thickened into snow. Snow layered into drifts that swallowed paths and blurred the boundaries between land and sky. The same mountains that glowed gold in summer became barriers in winter. Avalanches threatened narrow paths. Winds gathered strength in high valleys and rushed downward toward settlements below. The land demanded respect, and so medieval Norwegians built their lives in careful alignment with it. Homes were positioned where they might gain some shelter from prevailing winds. Fields were chosen not for beauty but for survival. Small pockets where soil lay deep enough to coax grain from stubborn earth. Livestock played a central role. Cows, sheep, and goats were not luxuries. They were warmth, milk, wool, and sustenance embodied. During summer months, animals grazed freely in higher pastures. In autumn, they were brought closer to home, sheltered as best as possible before heavy snow fell. In the north, even the sea transformed with the seasons. In summer, it was a pathway. In winter, it could become a boundary of ice and danger. Harbors sometimes froze along their edges. Boats were pulled onto shore and secured. Fishing continued where possible, but with caution. The geographies created a culture of watchfulness. Clouds gathering over peaks were not merely beautiful. They were signals. A shift in wind direction carried meaning. The thickness of ice along the fjord told a story about the coming weeks. Above all, people learned to read light. In late Utman, as days shortened rapidly above the Arctic Circle, the change was dramatic. Each sunrise climbed lower than the one before. Shadows lengthened. Sooner. The mountains swallowed the sun earlier in the afternoon. Then came the period of twilight days, when the sun barely rose above the horizon, casting long, slanting beams that painted the snow in hues of pink and gold. It was beautiful. And ominous, because beyond that fragile glow waited the true absence. For medieval communities, geographies was not something to conquer. It was something to negotiate with season by season, year by year. Isolation shaped temperament. There was little room for reckless optimism. Survival depended on practical foresight. Wood must be cut and stacked before snow fell. Roofs must be checked. Boats repaired. Nets mended. Grain threshed and stored. The land did not forgive delay, and yet despite its harshness, it offered profound beauty. Imagine standing on a ridge above a fjord in late October. The air is sharp, but not yet bitter. The sea reflects a sky streaked with early dusk. Smoke rises thinly from a handful of scattered homes below. Beyond them, mountains fade into blue shadow. It is a landscape that inspires humility, perhaps even reverence. In medieval Norway, long before scientific explanation, people understood that they were small within a vast design. The mountains would remain long after they were gone. The sea would continue its rhythm. The sun would return and depart, regardless of human longing. Living in such a place fosters patience. It teaches acceptance of cycles, and it makes the coming darkness less of a surprise, because it is written into the very shape of the land. When the sun finally disappeared below the horizon for the season, it did so behind mountains that had always been there. When twilight lingered at noon, it spread across fjords carved by ancient ice. The geography did not change when the light left, but the way people moved within it did. Travel shortened, voices lowered. Fires burned longer. Families drew closer. The land, vast and powerful in summer, seemed to shrink under snow and shadow. Distances felt greater. Horizons narrowed. Yet beneath that narrowing sky, something steady endured, an understanding that the same mountains now cloaked in darkness would one day blaze again in midnight sun, that the same fjords locked in ice would shimmer with open water, that the same fields buried beneath snow would sprout green shoots when warmth returned. In medieval Norway, the land was both trial and promise. It tested those who lived upon it, and it taught them to wait. As autumn slipped fully into winter, and the sun's arc sank lower each day, the people of the north did not panic. They prepared, because here, above the Arctic Circle, the disappearance of light was not catastrophe. It was simply the next movement in a cycle older than memory, and the land, stern, beautiful, enduring, would witness it all. When winter tightened its grip on northern Norway, the most important structure in a person's life was not a church, nor a marketplace, nor even a boat. It was the house. In medieval Norway, especially in the north, homes were not delicate wooden cottages perched lightly on the earth. They were built low, thick, unpurposeful, shaped by generations who understood that winter was not a passing inconvenience, but a dominant force. The typical rural dwelling in earlier medieval centuries resembled what we now call a longhouse. It was not grand in ornament, but it was intelligent in design. Timber formed the skeleton. Thick logs, carefully fitted. In forested regions, wood was the most abundant building material, and it was used with skill. The walls were heavy enough to block wind, but not perfectly sealed. Small drafts were inevitable. To fight the cold from above, many houses were crowned with turf roofs. Layers of birch bark were laid first for waterproofing, then thick slabs of sod placed on top. Over time, grass even grew across these roofs in warmer months. In winter, snow gathered atop the turf, and this was not entirely unwelcome. Snow, for all its bitterness outdoors, acts as insulation. A thick layer across the roof helped trap warmth inside. The house seemed almost to sink into the landscape, becoming part of it, earth and shelter blending into one. Windows were small, very small. Glass was rare and precious in much of medieval Scandinavia, especially outside churches and wealthy households. Most homes relied on wooden shutters or simple openings, covered with animal skin or thin translucent material. Light entered sparingly, even in summer. In winter, when the sun vanished, the house was never bright. Inside, the heart of everything was the hearth. Unlike modern fireplaces pressed against a wall, the medieval hearth often lay at the center of the main room. A long, rectangular fire pit lined with stone. Smoke rose upward toward a vent or hole in the roof, though much of it lingered first, drifting beneath the rafters. Ceilings were darkened by years of soot. Beams carried the scent of smoke permanently. The air inside was never entirely clear, but it was warm, or at least warmer than outside. Heat gathered closest to the fire. Those seated nearby felt its steady comfort. Those farther away relied on layers of wool and fur. Sleeping arrangements reflected this reality. Beds were often built along the walls, slightly raised from the floor. They were enclosed or partially shielded, lined with straw, wool blankets, and animal skins. Privacy was limited. Families slept in shared spaces. Children near parents, elders near the warmest areas. Body heat mattered. In deep winter, the house became more than shelter. It became a boundary between life and danger. Outside, temperatures could drop well below freezing. Wind could drive snow sideways across fjords and fields. In such conditions, exposure was not uncomfortable. It was lethal. So, doors were thick hinges, sturdy. Entrances sometimes angled or partially sheltered to prevent direct gusts from entering. Some longhouses combined living quarters and animal shelter under one roof. Livestock, kept at one end of the structure, provided more than food and labor. They generated warmth. The shared heat of cows and goats subtly raised the temperature within the building. It was practical. It was close. It was survival. Light inside the house came from more than the central fire. Oil lamps, often fueled by animal fat or fish oil, provided smaller, portable light sources. These lamps flickered softly, casting long shadows against timber walls. Tallow candles might be used sparingly, but they were precious, made from rendered fat, not wasted lightly. The interior glow was always uneven, bright near flame, dim in corners, alive with movement. In such light, faces appeared differently. Expressions soft, lines deepened. The world beyond the walls faded into abstraction. Darkness outside felt infinite. Inside, it felt contained, but containment required maintenance. Firewood had to be gathered long before snow fell too deep. Stacked carefully, protected from moisture. In northern regions where forests thinned near the coast, driftwood was sometimes collected and stored for winter use. To run out of fuel in January would be catastrophic, so households planned months ahead. The architecture itself reflected this mindset. Houses were not built for beauty alone. They were built for endurance. Repairs were constant cracks, roof sod replaced, timber reinforced. A house was never finished. It was maintained continuously, and over time, it carried memory. Smoke-blackened beams bore witness 2 years of winters. Floorboards smoothed by generations of feet. Doorframes worn by hands, entering and exiting against storms. During the long polar night, when the sun did not rise for weeks, the house shaped daily existence entirely. Morning and evening blurred into each other. Tasks were performed by firelight. Wool was spun near the hearth. Tools were carved by flickering lamp glow. Meals were prepared in the same steady illumination. Children learned to navigate dimness naturally. They understood which boards creaked, which corner held storage baskets, where the drafts slipped faintly along the wall. The house became a universe. Beyond its walls lay uncertainty. Within them lay familiarity. Sound behaved differently indoors during winter. Wind pressed against timber with low, mournful tones. Snow thudded softly from roof edges. Occasionally, the distant crack of shifting ice echoed from the fjord, but inside, closer sounds dominated. The snap of sap in burning wood, the low murmur of conversation, the steady breathing of animals, the rhythmic scrape of spindle against wool. It was a small world, but it was alive. Over weeks of darkness, the house did more than protect bodies. It protected morale. Humans are not meant to endure endless open darkness alone, but enclosed space, shared warmth and steady routine create psychological anchoring. The house defined boundaries. It said, here, within these walls, there is order. And so architecture in medieval Norway was not accidental. It was an adaptation, refined through centuries of observation. Every beam, every sod layer, every hearthstone represented lessons learned from winters past. When the sun disappeared entirely below the horizon, The house did not change, but its importance deepened. It became fortress, refuge, center of gravity. Outside, the sky could remain dark for weeks. Inside, a small sun burned steadily, contained within stone, fed by careful hands. And in that controlled glow, medieval families waited, not passively, but attentively, listening to wind, feeding flame, trusting that timber and turf would hold against the vast cold pressing from every side. The house stood between them and the endless night, and most winters. It was enough. Imagine living in a world where the sun disappears for months. Not just for a day, but for an entire season. This was the reality for people in medieval northern Norway during the Mørketid, too dark time, or what we call the polar night. In this endless darkness, one thing stood above all else as the giver of life, warmth, and hope: fire. Today, we re-journeying back in time to explore the profound importance of fire in the lives of those who called the frozen, dark north their home. Before the advent of electricity, the polar night was an immense challenge. From late November to late January, the sun wouldn't rise above the horizon. Life was dictated not by the sun, but by the flickering flames of the hearth. Fire was the center of the home, quite literally. The typical medieval Norwegian longhouse was built around a central, open fire pit, the eldstad. This wasn't just for cooking. It was the sole source of light and heat in a land gripped by sub-zero temperatures. Think about the sheer amount of resources this required. Gathering firewood wasn't a casual chore. It was a critical, year-long endeavor. During the short, intense summers, entire communities would work tirelessly, felling trees, chopping wood, and stacking it to dry. Birch was a favorite, as it burns hot and clean, but they used pine and whatever else they could find. They had to calculate exactly how much wood would be needed to survive months of darkness and cold. A miscalculation could be fatal. The wood had to be stored in dry, accessible places, often inside or attached to the longhouse, safe from the heavy snows that would soon blanket the landscape. Inside the longhouse, life revolved around the fire. It was a beacon in the oppressive dark. The smoke from the open hearth would fill the single large room, finding its way out through a hole in the roof. The lior. While this sounds incredibly smoky to us, it was a necessary trade-off. The smoke helped to preserve the timber of the roof and kept insects at bay during the warmer months. For the inhabitants, their eyes would have been accustomed to the sting. A small price to pay for the life-sustaining warmth and light. This central fire was the hub of all domestic activity. All meals were cooked over it. Kettles of stew would bubble away. Fish would be smoked in the rafters above, and flatbread would be baked on hot stones. The light it cast was just enough for essential tasks. Women would sit close to the flames to spin wool, mend clothes, or men would repair their tools, carve wood, or sharpen their knives. The firelight created a small, intimate circle of activity in an otherwise vast and dark world. It was the boundary between order and the unknown darkness outside. But the fire's role extended far beyond the practical. It was the heart of the community's social and cultural life. In the long, dark hours, with little outdoor work possible, people gathered around the hearth. It was here that stories were told, sagas were recited, and songs were sung. This was the medieval equivalent of our television, internet, and social media, all rolled into one. The elders would pass down ancestral knowledge, historical accounts, and mythological tales to the younger generations. The flickering flames would dance on their faces, casting long shadows that made the stories of trolls, draugr, and the gods feel incredibly real and immediate. The fire wasn't just a backdrop for these stories. It was a character in them, a symbol of civilization against the chaos of the wild, dark world. Spiritually, fire held immense significance. In Old Norse beliefs, fire was a sacred element, a connection to the divine. Rituals were often centered around fire. The Yule festival, which took place during the winter solstice, was a celebration of the eventual return of the sun. A Yule log would be burned in the hearth, its flames symbolizing the triumph of light and life over darkness and death. The fire was a promise that the sun, though absent, had not abandoned them and would return. It provided psychological comfort, a powerful defense against the seasonal depression that the endless night could bring. Fire was also a tool of industry. The local blacksmith, a crucial figure in any medieval community, depended on his forge. The intense heat of the forge fire was necessary to shape iron into essential items. Nails for their blades for their axes, and hooks for their fishing lines. Without a powerful, well-managed fire, these vital tools couldn't be made, and the community's ability to build, defend, and feed itself would be severely hampered. The glow of the smithiest fire would have been another beacon of light and productivity in the dark landscape. Let's not forget about outdoor travel. While movement was limited, it wasn't impossible. A torch, a bundle of resinous wood lit on fire, was the only way to navigate the immediate surroundings of the settlement. Traveling between settlements was incredibly dangerous and rarely done. But if necessary, fire was the only guide. Signal fires on hilltops could also be used for long-distance communication, a vital link in a sparsely populated region. A distant flame on a dark horizon could mean a call for help, a warning of danger, or news from another community. The constant presence of fire also meant a constant risk. A stray spark could easily ignite the dry timber of the longhouse or the thatched roof. Managing the fire was a skill passed down through generations. Children were taught from a young age how to tend the fire, how to feed it without smothering it, and how to bank the embers at night so they could be easily rekindled in the morning. A fire that went out during a blizzard could spell disaster, while a fire that grew out of control could destroy a home and everything in it. Within minutes, it was a delicate balance, a powerful servant that could quickly become a devastating master. So, when we think of medieval life in the Arctic Circle, we must see it through the warm glow of the fire. It was so much more than just a source of heat. It was the clock that marked the passing of the day, the kitchen where food was prepared, the workshop where tools were mended, the library where history was kept alive, and the temple where hope was rekindled. The fire was the very heartbeat of the community, a steady, warm pulse against the cold, silent, dark of the polar night. It allowed not just for survival, but for a rich and vibrant culture to flourish in one of the planet's most extreme environments. Long before the sun vanished below the horizon, long before the hearth burned day and night without interruption, there was a different kind of intensity in northern Norway. It was not the stillness of winter. It was urgency. In medieval communities above the Arctic Circle, survival during the polar night depended almost entirely on what had been done in the months before it. Autumn was not a gentle fading of summer. It was a reckoning. The days shortened rapidly in the north. Each sunrise climbed lower than the one before. Shadows lengthened. The air sharpened. There was beauty in the golden light across fjords and mountains. But beneath that beauty lay calculation. How much fish had been dried? How much grain stored? How much wood stacked? The answers to those questions would determine whether winter was endured in steadiness or in fear. Fishing was central. Along Norway's northern coast, cod migration brought opportunity. Large quantities of fish could be caught during productive seasons. Medieval fishermen worked from small boats, casting nets or lines into cold waters rich with life. But catching fish was only the first step. Preservation was everything. Cod were split open, cleaned carefully, and hung on tall wooden racks along the shore. There, exposed to steady coastal winds and cool air, they dried naturally. Over weeks, moisture left the flesh. What remained was hard, durable, stocked fish light in weight, dense in nourishment, capable of lasting months without spoiling. Rows of feasts, suspended against autumn sky, became familiar sights in coastal settlements. They represented security. Meat preservation followed similar principles. Livestock could not all be kept through winter. Fodder was limited. Some animals were slaughtered in late autumn. Meat was salted heavily and stored in barrels. In colder regions, freezing air aided preservation. Nothing was wasted. Bones for broth, fat for cooking or candle making, hides for clothing and bedding. Root vegetables were harvested before frost hardened the ground completely. Turnips, carrots, and hardy greens were stored in cool, dark pits or cellars. Barley and oats were grown successfully in small fields, were threshed and kept dry. The geography limited abundance, but discipline stretched it. Fuel gathering was equally urgent. What had to be cut, split, and stacked well before snow deepened. Wet wood in January would smoke poorly and burn weakly. Dry timber meant warmth. Warmth meant survival. Men and older boys often handled heavy cutting. Though labor divisions were practical rather than strictly rigid, everyone contributed where they could. Even children gathered smaller branches, carried kindling, assisted in stacking. The community rhythm in autumn felt concentrated. There was little idle time. Wool from sheep shorn earlier in summer had to be processed. It was washed, carded, spun into thread. Some weaving began before winter, some continued during it. Clothing needed repair. Cloaks thickened, mittens prepared, boots reinforced. Cold would not forgive neglect. Boats were pulled ashore and inspected, cracks sealed with tar, oars stored carefully, nets mended, tools sharpened. Autumn light, in the north, possesses a particular clarity. The air is crisp, colors vivid. Mountains seem nearer, but with each passing day, daylight shrinks noticeably. People felt that shrinking physically. There was a rhythm to it, a tightening. Sunset came earlier. Morning light arrived later. The brief window for outdoor work narrowed. And then came the twilight days. Above the Arctic Circle, the sun's path in late autumn becomes so low that it barely clears the southern horizon. At noon, light slants, almost sideways, stretching long shadows across frost-covered ground. It is beautiful. It is also a warning, because once the sun's arc dips fully below the horizon, it will not return for weeks. Medieval Norwegians did not calculate this with astronomical charts, but they observed it with care. Generations had watched the pattern. They knew approximately when the last true sunrise would occur. There was no official announcement, only awareness. In the final days before polar night, some may have paused briefly at midday, turning faces toward that low, fragile sun. Not in ceremony, but in recognition. Soon, this would be gone. The psychological preparation mattered as much as physical storage. Communities accustomed to this cycle did not greet it with panic, but neither did they ignore its weight. Tasks became methodical. Inventory counted mentally. Barrels checked. Roofs inspected for weakness before snow accumulation. Doors reinforced against swelling wood and drifting snow. Livestock brought closer. Barns stocked with hay gathered during short summer abundance. There was a sense, perhaps, of drawing inward. The land itself seemed to prepare. Leaves fell entirely from trees. Grass faded beneath frost. The sea darkened under heavy skies. And then one morning, the sun failed to crest the mountains. The polar night had begun. But because of autumn's labor, households were not empty-handed. Inside the longhouse, fish hung from rafters. Barrels lined walls. Wood stacks stood near entrances. Bundles of dried herbs and roots were tucked into corners. Firewood near the hearth promised warmth. Oil rendered from animals promised light. Preparation transformed fear into steadiness. Still, preparation did not eliminate uncertainty. What if storms damaged fishing racks too early? What if illness struck midwinter? What if fuel ran lower than expected? Medieval life did not offer guarantees, but preparation offered resilience. In the far north, above the Arctic Circle, people learned that survival during the long night was not won by strength alone. It was won by foresight. Each split log represented an hour of future warmth. Each dried fish, a meal in darkness. Each mended net, a promise of spring return. Autumn was not merely a season. It was an act of faith in the cycle. Work done in light would sustain life in shadow. And so, as the final autumn sun dipped below the horizon for the last time, families closed shutters, not in desperation, but in readiness. They had stored what they could. They had repaired what they could. They had gathered, salted, dried, spun, stacked. The endless night would test them, but it would not catch them unprepared. Above the mountains, the sky darkened fully. Inside timber walls, fire was lit. Barrels sealed, doors closed against wind. The work of autumn now gave way to the endurance of winter. And in that transition from preparation to patience, medieval northern Norway entered its longest season. There is a particular morning in northern Norway when expectation lingers a little longer than usual. It happens in late autumn, above the Arctic Circle, when the sun has been skimming lower and lower across the southern horizon for weeks. Each day, its arc has grown shorter. Each afternoon, shadows have stretched farther. And then one morning, the light does not crest the mountains at all. In a settlement near what we now call Tromsø, or in smaller scattered farms along nearby fjords, people would have risen as they always did, not to an alarm clock, but to routine, to the fading embers of the hearth, to the soft breath of livestock, to the weight of wool blankets. They would expect the dim twilight glow to grow stronger toward midday, but on this day, it does not. Instead, the sky remains a deep cobalt blue, almost luminous, but never bright. A faint band of muted color may appear along the southern edge of the world. Pink, violet, or pale amber, but the sun itself remains hidden below the horizon. It will not rise again for weeks. The polar night has begun. In medieval times, this was not marked on calendars with scientific precision, but it was known, observed, remembered from the year before, passed down in quiet understanding from parent to child. Still, knowledge does not lessen the strangeness of the first day without sunrise. Without that daily ascent of light, something fundamental shifts. The body notices. Human rhythms evolved under a rising and setting sun. When morning fails to brighten fully, the sense of time feels suspended. The day seems hesitant to begin. Outside the longhouse, the world takes on a muted quality. Snow reflects faint ambient light from below the horizon, creating a dim, bluish glow. It is not darkness, like midnight. It is a kind of extended twilight, subdued, almost dreamlike. Mountains appear as silhouettes. The sea reflects dull steel tones. Trees stand black against a sky that never quite turns pale. Shadows lose their direction. There is no clear east or west in the sky's glow. For those who must step outdoors, to tend animals, gather wood, or check fishing equipment. Near the shore, the absence of direct sunlight changes perception. Depth feels uncertain. Distances blur slightly in dimness. Sound becomes more pronounced. Boots compress snow with sharper clarity. Wind across frozen ground hums in low tones. The distant crack of shifting ice echoes farther. Without bright daylight, hearing sharpens. Inside, life continues. Tasks do not vanish because the sun has. Animals still require feeding. Water must be drawn or melted from snow. Food must be prepared, but light now comes entirely from within. The hearth burns longer during the day. Oil lamps are lit earlier. Work once done under pale daylight now takes place in firelit glow. The psychological weight of this first day is subtle but real. For those born into the region, it is familiar, but familiarity does not erase sensation. There is an awareness, perhaps unspoken. We have entered the long stretch. Children may ask questions. When will the sun come back? How many days until we see it again? Adults answer not with precise numbers, but with reference to memory. After the great feast day, after several market cycles, after the deepest cold, time is measured in experience, not digits. During the first days of polar night, communities adjust gradually. Some may venture outdoors less frequently and less necessary. Travel between settlements slows. Risk increases in dim light and uncertain weather. Weather itself becomes more significant. Cloud cover can deepen darkness dramatically. A heavily overcast polar night feels heavier than a clear one. On cloudless days, starlight and moonlight reflect brilliantly off snow, offering a strange, quiet illumination. And sometimes, the aurora returns. Green ribbons shimmer across black sky, moving silently above fjords and mountains. Medieval Norwegians did not understand solar particles interacting with Earth's magnetic field, but they knew the lights were extraordinary. Some may have seen them as spirits dancing, others as signs. Some simply watched in silence, breath visible in cold air. In a world without electric glow, the aurora would have seemed impossibly vivid, but even these celestial displays did not replace the sun. The sun carried warmth, psychological if not always physical in winter. Its absence is felt not only in brightness, but in direction. Days lose clear edges, sleep patterns begin to shift. Some people wake later. Others find themselves restless at odd hours. Without sunrise to anchor the morning, routine becomes more dependent on internal discipline and communal expectation. The hearth is stoked earlier. Meals mark passage of time. Storytelling fills extended evenings. The first week without sunrise often feels longest. There is adjustment, but medieval northern communities were not fragile in this regard. Generations had endured the same cycle. Houses were built for it. Food was stored for it. Stories were told about it. The darkness was not interpreted as punishment. I was seasick, yet that does not mean it lacked emotional texture. Standing outside on one of those first sunless days, one might look southward, hoping for a sliver of gold to break the mountain line. Instead, only dim glow. It can stir a quiet longing, but it can also stir resilience. Because in this land, absence is temporary. The same mountains that now block the sun will one day frame its return. The same fjords that reflect blue shadow will blaze with summer light. The cycle is not broken. It is turning. Inside timber walls, life narrows slightly. Firelight defines space. Conversation softens. Movements become more deliberate. The polar night does not fall like a curtain. It settles gradually. Day after day without sunrise builds awareness slowly. At first, one notices its absence. Later, one forgets what bright midday felt like. Darkness becomes normal, and in that normalization lies the true adaptation. In medieval northern Norway, when the sun stopped rising, panic did not follow. Preparation met patience. Fire met shadow. Routine met uncertainty. The sky remained dark above the mountains, but within homes and communities, light persisted. Human-made, carefully tended, unwavering. And so, the first day without sunrise passed. Then, the second. Then, the third. And with each one, the long night deepened, not as catastrophe, but as a season fully arrived. When the sun disappears from the Arctic sky, light does not vanish completely. It changes hands. In medieval northern Norway, above the Arctic Circle, illumination became a human responsibility. The hearth still burned at the center of the longhouse, but beyond its immediate glow, other small lights were necessary. Work required focus. Movement required visibility. Faces required definition. And so, during the long polar night, the people created their own constellation indoors. The most common secondary source of light was the oil lamp. These were simple but effective devices, often carved from stone or fashioned from metal in wealthier households. They held animal fat or fish oil substances rendered carefully from previous harvests and slaughter. A wick, made from twisted plant fiber or wool, rested partially submerged in the oil. When lit, it produced a steady, modest flame, smaller and calmer than the hearth fire. It offered directional light enough to illuminate hands at work. The smell of these lamps was distinctive. Seal oil, fish oil, tallow. Each carried its own scent. In the enclosed space of a longhouse, that scent mingled with smoke from the hearth, with drying wool, with stored fish and timber. Winter air indoors was thick, but familiar. Candles were also used, though sparingly. Tallow candles, made from animal fat, required effort to produce. Beeswax candles were rarer still and often associated with churches or wealthier households. A candle flame was precious. It burned steadily but briefly compared to stored oil. Each inch consumed represented labor from months before. So candles were reserved for specific needs, delicate tasks, ritual observance, or moments of gathering. Light in winter was never wasted. The quality of lamplight differed from firelight. Where the hearth flickered broadly and unpredictably, oil lamps glowed in steadier, smaller circles. They created islands of clarity within a sea of shadow. Edges of the room remained dim. The interplay between light and darkness shaped perception. Objects near flame appeared detailed and warm-toned. Beyond that radius, shapes softened into suggestion. A bench became outline. A beam became silhouette. Movement of a hand could cast large, shifting shadows across walls, turning simple gestures into dramatic forms. Children raised in such environments learn to read shadow as easily as substance. During the long polar night, this dim illumination was constant. Even during what passed for midday, the sky provided little more than faint twilight. Indoor lamps remained necessary throughout much of the day. Light regulated activity. Spinning wool required focused glow. The spindle's movement had to be seen clearly to maintain even thread. Wood carving demanded careful observation of grain. Repairing fishing nets required precision. The small flame became companion to craft. But light also shaped emotion. There is something intimate about gathering around a lamp in a dark room. Faces lean closer. Voices lower naturally. Attention narrows. In medieval northern households, storytelling thrived in such conditions. Oral sagas passed from generation to generation often found their home in firelit rooms. The absence of bright distraction allowed imagination to fill shadows. A tale of distant voyages or mountain spirits felt more vivid when told in dimness. The lamp flame trembled slightly with each draft, making shadows move along walls. In that shifting glow, stories breathed. Outside, the polar night stretched immense and silent. Inside, human light pushed gently against it. But maintaining light required planning. Oil had to be rendered carefully from fat. Wicks replaced as they charred, lamps cleaned to prevent soot buildup. Supplies monitored so they lasted through the full stretch of winter. Running out of oil mid-season would force greater reliance on the hearth, limiting mobility within the house and concentrating work near one area. Every resource mattered. In some households, particularly in coastal communities with access to abundant fish oil provided reliable fuel. In inland areas, animal fat played greater role. Variations in geography influenced the texture of light indoors. Even the color of flame differed slightly, depending on fuel. Small distinctions shaped experience. There were nights when the sky outside was clear and the moon full. Snow reflected lunar light brilliantly, casting a faint silver glow through cracks and shutters. On such evenings, stepping outdoors felt almost luminous. The world transformed into quiet blue and white. On overcast nights, however, darkness felt absolute. The absence of moon and stars deepened the sense of enclosure. In those times, the indoor lamp seemed even more precious. Light also marked ritual moments. In Christian communities, candlelight carried sacred symbolism. During winter feasts, churches glowed softly in contrast to the dark outside. Flickering altar candles echoed the hearth flames of homes, connecting domestic and spiritual light. Even in households where older Norse traditions lingered beneath Christian practice, flame retained symbolic weight. It represented continuity, the passing of warmth from one generation to the next. A mother lighting a lamp from the hearth was not simply performing a task. She was transferring light. In months without sunrise, this mattered deeply. The polar night did not erase beauty. It, risape d'Italiano light, became sculptural. It emphasized texture, the weave of wool, the carved edge of wood, the grain of timber walls. People noticed subtle details more keenly because brightness did not overwhelm them. Darkness sharpened attention. Yet there were challenges. Extended dim light could strain eyes. Fine work demanded proximity to flame. Smoke irritation persisted. Shadows sometimes played tricks on perception, especially for children whose imaginations were active. But adaptation came naturally over generations. People learned where to place lamps for maximum efficiency. They learned how much oil to pour for desired burn time. They learned how to trim wicks to reduce smoke. Light was managed carefully. In a season when the sun refused to rise, medieval northern Norwegians did not surrender to blackness. They crafted illumination deliberately. Small, steady, human. The hearth burned at the center. Lamps glowed at the edges. Candles flickered during special moments. Together, these lights formed a quiet resistance against the vast polar night. Outside, mountains and fjords lay in shadow. Inside, faces were visible. Hands worked. Stories were told, and though the sun remained hidden beyond the horizon, light carefully tended. Endure. When the sun no longer rises and the sky remains dim for weeks, Life does not pause in medieval northern Norway. It simply moves inward. Winter is not a season of idleness. It is a season of different labor. Quieter, more deliberate, but no less essential. Inside the longhouse, the hearth glows steadily. Oil lamps flicker near benches and work tables. Snow presses softly against outer walls. Wind hums low beyond timber beams. And within that sheltered space, hands remain busy. One of the most constant winter tasks was textile work. Wool, shorn from sheep during the brighter months, had already been washed and dried before heavy cold set in. But spinning and weaving often continued deep into winter. A spindle turns slowly near the hearth. Fingers draft fibers into fine thread. The motion is repetitive, almost meditative. Twist, draw, wind, repeat. The soft whir of spindle wood against wool blends with the crackle of fire. Thread becomes yarn, yarn becomes cloth. Thick woolen fabric is not a luxury here, it is defense. Cloaks, mittens, stockings, blankets. Every layer matters when stepping into sub-zero air. Weaving requires more space and more light. Looms, sometimes upright against walls, stretch, threads taut. The shuttle passes back and forth in steady rhythm. The process is slow, deliberate. Winter provides the time for it. Beyond textiles, tools require maintenance. Fishing nets, dried and stored from autumn, are examined carefully. Any weakness in cord could mean lost catch in spring. Knots are retied. Broken sections replaced. Precision matters. Wooden tools, handles of axes, oars, sled components are inspected for cracks. The dry indoor air of winter can split wood if neglected. Repairs are made by firelight. Carving becomes common indoor craft. Wood is abundant in many regions of Norway. In winter, small items are shaped inside. Spoons, bowls, combs, tool grips, decorative elements. The sound of knife against wood is soft, but constant. Scrape. Pause. Turn the piece. Scrape again. The scent of fresh wood mingles with smoke. Children watch closely. They learn by observation first, imitation later. Skills are passed quietly, through demonstration rather than instruction manuals. Winter is apprenticeship season. There is also food work. Though much of preservation was completed in autumn, stored goods require monitoring. Dried fish must remain dry. Salted meat checked for spoilage. Grain protected from dampness. Occasionally, fish is softened in broth. Meat is cut and rationed carefully. Nothing is consumed without awareness of how long winter may yet last. In wealthier or more connected settlements, limited trade may still occur. Eben in winter, though less frequently. Goods acquired during autumn markets are inventoried and repaired if necessary. Clothing receives constant attention. Mittens wear thin at fingertips. Cloaks fray at edges. Boots crack in cold if not treated with care. Leather is softener near the hearth. Seams are sewn with steady hands. Even leisure contains productivity. Storytelling sessions often occur alongside work. One person spins wool while another recounts events of ancestors or tales of distant fjords and oral tradition thrives in winter not because there is nothing to do, but because hands are occupied while ears remain free. The long polar night creates extended evenings. Without sunrise to sharply divide day from night, time feels elastic. Tasks stretch gently across hours. There is less rush than in autumn. More endurance. Men who fished heavily in summer now mend the nets or carve sled runners. Women who managed harvest and preservation now weave and sew. Roles overlap naturally, depending on household needs. Winter indoors does not eliminate hierarchy entirely, but survival often softens rigid divisions. Everyone contributes where able. In some homes, musical instruments appear in the glow of the hearth. Simple stringed instruments, perhaps, or rhythmic tapping on wood. Music fills space that silence might otherwise claim. Silence itself, however, is not feared. There are long moments when only the fire speaks. In the absence of sunlight, attention narrows to what is immediate. Hands, tools, thread, with grain. There is a focus to winter labor that summer rarely allows. Summer demands speed. Fishing must be done quickly. Crops harvested before weather shifts. Travel undertaken while seas are open. Winter, by contrast, demands steadiness. Small improvements made indoors accumulate. A repaired net means better catch in spring. A newly woven cloak means better protection next season. A carved tool handle improves grip in icy wind. Winter work prepares future survival, but it also preserves morale. Human beings require purpose. Extended darkness without activity can weigh heavily on the mind, but structured work, even repetitive work, anchors time. It prevents days from dissolving entirely into each other. Children are given small tasks suited to their ability. Sorting wool, holding a spindle, fetching small sticks for kindling. These tasks build confidence and belonging. The house hums with quiet industry. Even animals indoors require attention. Bedding refreshed. Feed, meals, illness monitored. Livestock are valuable assets. Winter losses are costly, and always, the hearth remains center stage. Work is arranged around its warmth. Hands occasionally extend toward flame to regain feeling. Shoulders shift to avoid drifting smoke. Light is limited, so precision is practiced carefully. When fatigue sets in, work slows, but rarely stops entirely. Winter indoors is not dramatic. It is persistent. There are days when wind roars loudly enough to rattle shutters. On those days, outdoor tasks cease entirely. The house becomes a world. On clearer days, brief ventures outside may occur to check storage sheds, gather additional wood, inspect snow accumulation on roofs. But most of life contracts within timber walls. In the long polar night, productivity becomes intimate. The grand landscape of fjords and mountains recedes from daily attention. In its place, thread between fingers, knife against wood. Quiet conversation. The absence of the sun does not erase human rhythm. It changes its tempo. Inside the longhouse, beneath so darkened beams, winter work unfolds slowly and steadily. Each completed task is small, but meaningful. And when evening deepens, though evening and afternoon are nearly indistinguishable, tools are set aside. Hands rest. The hearth is stirred. And in that warm circle of light, the day, though sunless, has been full. When darkness stretches across weeks and the sun does not rise, the mind begins to wander. In medieval northern Norway, where the polar night could linger long above the horizon, storytelling became more than entertainment. It became warmth of another kind. Inside the longhouse, after tools were set aside and the evening meal eaten, the hearth glowed low and steady. Oil lamps flickered gently. Wind pressed softly against turf-covered roofs. The house quieted, and then someone began to speak. In earlier centuries, before Christianity fully shaped Norwegian culture, stories of gods and giants traveled from mouth to mouth. Tales of Odin, wisdom, Thor's hammer, and Loki's mischief would have filled winter evenings. Even after conversion to Christianity around the 10th and 11th centuries, these older myths did not vanish overnight. They lingered in memory, soft, perhaps reshaped, but not forgotten entirely. Alongside them came stories of saints, miracles, and biblical journeys, narratives introduced by priests and woven into local life. Winter evenings made room for both. The sagas, long, complex oral histories of families and heroes, were particularly suited to polar night. They were detailed, layered, and often recited over multiple evenings. Genealogies were remembered carefully. Feats of endurance retold with precision. Voyages across stormy seas described in rhythmic language. Children listened wide-eyed in firelight, shadows moving across their faces as flames shifted. Storytelling in such conditions was immersive in a way difficult to replicate in bright modern rooms. The darkness outside sharpened imagination. A tale of a mountain spirit felt more immediate when the mountains themselves lay hidden in shadow beyond the walls. A story of a ship lost at sea resonated deeply when fjords lay silent and frozen under moonlight. In winter, narrative bridged isolation. 4 scattered farms separated by miles of snow and darkness, shared stories formed cultural threads stronger than rope. Even when physical travel was limited, memory traveled freely. Story also preserved history. In a largely oral culture, events were not archived in books but carried in voices. Winter provided the time to rehearse them, refine them, correct them. Mistakes could be challenged, details debated. Elders corrected younger tellers gently. Accuracy mattered, especially in family sagas. Because stories were inheritance. They reminded listeners who they were, where they came from, and how others before them had endured hardship. In polar night, this mattered profoundly. When the sun fails to rise day after day, it is easy for time to feel suspended. Stories restore direction. They speak of seasons past and seasons yet to come. They remind listeners that winter is not endless, only recurring. Storytelling also served emotional balance. Fear is easier to confront when shaped into narrative. Tales of trolls, forest spirits, and hidden creatures may have carried cautionary lessons. Warnings about wandering too far alone, about respecting landscape, about humility in nature's presence. But they also gave form to the unknown. The darkness outside was vast, but in story, darkness could be named, personified, understood. Christian narratives introduced different kinds of comfort, stories of perseverance, sacrifice, redemption. These themes resonated deeply in a land where endurance was daily practice. Church gatherings during winter reinforced communal bonds, but at home, the hearth became a smaller chapel of memory and myth. The structure of storytelling itself adapted to long evenings. Unlike short anecdotes, exchanged quickly in summer light, winter tales unfolded slowly. They paused for detail. They built atmosphere carefully. Listeners had time. There was no urgent daylight waiting outside. Firelight made faces expressive. Pauses felt longer. The crackle of logs punctuated sentences. Silence between words was not uncomfortable. It was part of the rhythm. Music sometimes accompanied story. A simple instrument strummed lightly beneath spoken lines, or a chant repeated softly by multiple voices. Children learned cadence before they learned letters. They absorbed tone, emphasis, pacing. Winter made memory strong. Beyond myth and legend, everyday stories mattered too. Accounts of last year's harsh storm, of a neighbor's clever solution to a broken sled, of a time when food ran low and was shared. These smaller narratives reinforced trust and resilience. They said, "We have survived before. We will survive again." The psychological weight of polar night cannot be underestimated. Extended darkness affects mood, energy, perception, but medieval communities did not face it in silence. They filled it with voice. Imagine a midwinter night deep in polar darkness. Outside, snow reflects faint starlight. Inside, a dozen figures sit within reach of hearth warmth. The air smells of wood smoke and wool. An elder begins a saga slow, measured, confident. Children lean closer. A younger adult corrects a detail gently. Laughter rises briefly at a remembered mischief. Then quiet returns. The story continues. Beyond the walls, the Arctic sky remains star-filled and cold. Mountains stand unseen. Fjords lie still. But inside, warmth expands through narrative. Time passes almost unnoticed. And when at last the tale pauses, when eyelids grow heavy and lamps dim, listeners carry its imagery into sleep. In this way, storytelling became lantern for the mind. When the sun withdrew, memory illuminated. When landscape darkened, imagination brightened. And through repeated retelling, each generation stitched itself into continuity. Winter was no longer merely a stretch of cold and absence. It was a season of listening, a season of remembering, a season when the human voice rose gently against the vast silence of the Arctic night and filled it. Imagine a world where the sun disappears for months. This wasn't a fantasy. It was reality for people living in medieval northern Norway. Life during the polar night was a constant negotiation with an environment both beautiful and deadly. Even with a well-stocked home and a steady fire, staying indoors wasn't an option. Survival demanded that people venture out into the profound cold. The first thing you'd feel stepping outside wasn't just cold. It was pressure. The Arctic air presses against you, sharpens your breath into a visible cloud, and tightens your skin in seconds. It is the kind of cold that makes timber grown in snow squeak under your boots like crushed glass. But look up, and the reward was breathtaking. With no modern light pollution, the winter sky was a spectacle. Stars burned with an intensity we can barely imagine today, scattered across the blackness like a spill of diamonds. And then, the true magic. The aurora borealis, the northern lights, rippling silently in waves of green, pink, and violet. A celestial dance in the heart of darkness. Of course, beauty didn't make it any less dangerous. Venturing out required serious preparation. Clothing was a science of layers. Wool against the skin for warmth, even when damp. Thick, fur-lined cloaks to block the wind. Double-layered mittens, and hoods pulled tight. Exposed skin was an invitation to frostbite, so every inch was covered. Leather boots, insulated with straw or soft fur, were essential for keeping feet from freezing. For coastal communities, the sea remained a lifeline, even in winter. Fishing didn't stop entirely, where fjords remained partially unfrozen. Small boats would cautiously hug the shoreline. Ice constantly formed on the holes, needing to be chipped away. In other areas, where the ice was thick enough, they practiced ice fishing. Imagine the scene. A lone figure, crouched over a small hole cut through feet of solid ice, patiently waiting. The silence would have been absolute, broken only by the wind. A modest catch of cod or char was a vital supplement to dried meats and stored grains. But the ice was a fickle friend. Its thickness could vary wildly, weakened by hidden currents. A single misstep could mean a plunge into lethally cold water, a fate from which rescue was nearly impossible. Survival on the ice wasn't about luck. It was about knowledge passed down through generations. They knew which fjords froze solid, which currents to avoid, and how to read the snow for signs of weak spots. Travel over land was just as challenging. In deep snow, simple walking was impossible. People relied on snowshoes, wide wooden frames that distributed their weight and kept them from sinking. For longer distances or for carrying supplies, sleds were key. Pulled by strong reindeer or even by the people themselves, wooden runners glided over the packed snow, making it possible to connect with neighboring settlements for trade, news, or aid. Reindeer were especially crucial for the Sami people of the region. Masters of herding and navigating this frozen world, the greatest fear was the weather's unpredictability. A clear, starry sky could vanish in minutes, replaced by a swirling blizzard. A whiteout was the ultimate nightmare. In these conditions, the horizon disappears completely. Land and sky merge into a single, disorienting field of white. Landmarks vanish. Without a compass, travelers relied solely on their memory of the terrain, the shape of a familiar ridgeline, or an instinct honed by a lifetime of experience. A short walk to a neighbor's farm could become a fight for your life. This is why winter gatherings felt so special. The effort it took to reach one another too. Crows a frozen fjord or a snow-drifted field, the warmth of community feel that much more precious. The shared light of a longhouse fire was a beacon against the vast, indifferent darkness outside. Animals, too, needed constant care. Barns had to be checked, their roofs cleared of heavy snow to prevent collapse. Water troughs had to be kept free of ice. And while hunting was limited, it continued. Tracks in the snow were a clear advantage, revealing the movement of foxes, hares, or even the howl of a distant wolf was a reminder that humans were not the only ones enduring the long winter. Every trip outdoors was a stark reminder of the contrast that defined their lives. Outside, immense, silent, and frigid. Inside, contained, noisy, and warm. This constant back and forth shaped their entire existence. People didn't just wander in the polar night. They moved with purpose. Every step was calculated, every journey a risk assessed. And yet, in the midst of this struggle, there were moments of profound wonder. Standing under a sky ablaze with the aurora, feeling your breath crystallize in the air, you would feel incredibly small, but also deeply connected to the world around you. The darkness didn't erase beauty, it amplified it. Moonlight would turn the snow-covered landscape into a world of silver and blue. Ice formations along the shore would catch the faint light and glimmer like jewels. These people didn't conquer the Arctic winter. They endured it. They lived within it, adapting their lives to its powerful rhythm. and every single time they returned from the cold, their faces red, and their boots crusted with frost. The sight of smoke rising from the longhouse roof was a profound symbol of grace. It meant fire. It meant family. It meant light. Venturing into the frozen world was a necessity, but returning from it was life itself. Through the long, dark months, this was the rhythm of survival. Go out. Face the cold, gather what is needed, and return to the warmth. Darkness may have ruled the sky, but beneath it, life mowed on cautious and steady, across the snow and ice. In medieval northern Norway, the long polar night was not merely a physical experience. It was spiritual terrain. By the High Middle Ages, Norway had formally embraced Christianity. Churches stood even in remote settlements, sometimes small wooden stave structures rising against fjords and mountains. Priests traveled when possible. Feast days marked the calendar. Bells rang when weather allowed. Yet, beneath the surface of Christian practice, older beliefs lingered, memories of Norse cosmology, of spirits within mountains and forests, of unseen presences in dark places. Winter brought all of this closer to the surface. When the sun disappeared entirely below the horizon, when daylight thinned into endless twilight, people naturally turned inward. Toward, meaning, imagine a small wooden stave church standing against a snow-covered landscape, its steep roof crowned with carved dragon heads, remnants of earlier artistic traditions blending into Christian architecture. Snow gathers along its edges. Smoke rises faintly from nearby homes. Inside, candles flicker. During the polar night, attending church required effort. Travel was more dangerous. Snow obscured paths. Winds could intensify quickly, but winter feast days still mattered. Advent, leading toward Christmas, held particular weight in a land where literal darkness deepened as spiritual anticipation grew. The symbolism would not have been lost on medieval worshippers. Light entering darkness. Candles lit within the church stood against vast shadow outside. The priest's voice echoed softly against wooden walls. Breath rose in faint mist and cold interiors. The act of gathering itself became sacred. In such conditions, faith was not abstract theology. It was shared endurance. Christian teachings spoke of suffering, patience, redemption, hope. In northern Norway's polar night, these were not distant metaphors. They were lived realities. The story of light returning to the world resonated deeply in a region where light physically disappeared. But Christianity did not erase older instincts entirely. Before conversion, Norse cosmology had already made room for cycles, for darkness and light, destruction and renewal. Ragnarok itself, the great end and rebirth in Norse myth, held themes of inevitable transformation. In winter, when the land seemed suspended between life and death, such stories may have lingered in quiet thought. Even after official conversion, elements of older belief likely blended with Christian worldview in subtle ways. Mountains still felt powerful. Forests still held mystery. The aurora, shimmering above fjords, may have been interpreted through multiple lenses: divine sign, spiritual presence, celestial wonder. Faith in winter was not always expressed in grand ceremony. Often it appeared in small rituals at home: a candle lit before a meal, a quiet prayer before stepping into snowstorm, a whispered blessing over livestock. When the sun failed to rise for weeks, reassurance came not from visible sky, but from invisible trust. Church bells, when rung, carried farther in cold air. Their sound drifted across snowfields and frozen water, echoing gently against the mountains. That sound alone could anchor a community. It reminded scattered households that they were not alone in darkness. Even those unable to travel to service might pause when they heard it, offering silent acknowledgement of shared belief. Winter also sharpened awareness of mortality. Cold claimed leaves swiftly if caution failed. Illness could spread in enclosed spaces. Medical knowledge was limited. Faith offered framework for such uncertainty. It did not eliminate fear, but it placed suffering within narrative larger than season. The long polar night, then, became a kind of spiritual mirror. Darkness outside invited contemplation inside. Without bright destruction, reflection deepened. People had time to think while spinning wool, while tending fire, while walking cautiously beneath star-filled sky. What is the meaning of this cycle? Why must light withdraw? What does endurance teach? Medieval theology often framed suffering as test or purification. Whether universally accepted or not, such ideas found natural resonance in Arctic winter. To persist through months of darkness required humility. It required patience. It required acknowledgement of forces larger than oneself. And so faith, whether shaped by church doctrine or inherited memory of older myth, functioned as quiet strength. The image of Christ as light of the world would have held visceral clarity in polar night. When scripture spoke of light shining in darkness, it was not poetic exaggeration in northern Norway. It was daily reality. Candles in a church were not symbolic alone. They were practical defiance against shadow. The priest's sermon might speak of resurrection in spring, of hope after trial, of steadfastness. Outside, snow pressed against wooden walls. Inside, heads bowed. Children fidgeted softly on benches. Adults listened intently. In that candlelit space, time felt layered, ancient, and immediate at once. After service, people stepped back into dim twilight. The church door closed. The wind resumed its quiet voice. But something traveled home with them. Not warmth that would come from hearth, but orientation, a sense that winter, though long, was not purposeless. Faith also structured the calendar during polar night. Feast days punctuated darkness. Even without visible sunrise, these markers gave shape to weeks. Advent, Christmas, Epiphany. Each brought small variations, special meal, additional candle, communal gathering when possible. These punctuations prevented winter from dissolving entirely into sameness. The polar night could blur days together. Faith separated them gently. In scattered farms across northern Norway, medieval families balanced physical survival with spiritual grounding. They tended fire, they mended nets, they told stories, and they prayed. Not always in grand language, not always in formal setting, but in quiet recognition that darkness was not ultimate. Above the horizon, the sun remained hidden. But belief, whether in divine light, in returning cycle, or in resilience shaped by generations, burned steadily within. And so the long night deepened. Snow fell. Wind shifted. Stars wheeled overhead, unseen by many indoors. Yet within timber houses and wooden churches, small flames flickered faithfully. Human light, spiritual light, patient light, waiting, as always, for dawn. When the sun disappears for weeks above the Arctic Circle, something subtle begins to shift inside the human body. In medieval northern Norway, people did not speak of circadian rhythms or seasonal affective patterns. They did not measure melatonin levels or track vitamin deficiencies. But they knew, through lived experience, that the long night changed how one felt. Without sunrise, morning loses its sharp beginning. Without sunset, evening loses its gentle closure. The sky remains in a suspended state of twilight and shadow. Time stretches. Days feel longer and shorter at once. In the first weeks of polar night, sleep patterns often drift. Some wake later than usual. Others stir in the deep quiet of what might once have been early morning. Without strong daylight cues, the body relies more heavily on routine and responsibility. The hearth becomes anchor. When embers are stirred at a certain hour, morning begins, whether or not the sky confirms it. When lamps are dimmed and fire banked, rest follows. In this way, medieval households created artificial structure in place of the sun's guidance. But structure alone does not erase emotional weight. Extended darkness can narrow perception. It can soften energy. It can make the outside world feel distant and unreal. And yet, medieval northern communities did not collapse under this pressure. They adapted. Community was first protection. In the scattered geography of fjords and farms, isolation was real. But within each household, life was shared closely. Multiple generations often lived under one roof. Work was communal. Meals communal. Stories communal. Rarely was someone alone for long. Loneliness thrives in silence and separation. But winter longhouses were rarely silent, even in quiet moments. Breath, shifting wood, soft conversation filled space. Children played near the hearth. Elders spoke slowly. Adults worked steadily. Human presence buffered psychological strain. Routine also served as medicine. Winter work, though repetitive, provided rhythm. Spin wool, mend a net, carve wood, stir stew, chet livestock. Repeat tomorrow. Purpose anchors the mind. In the absence of sunlight's clear progression, tasks marked time. The mind could settle into known sequences. There were, undoubtedly, difficult days, storms that lasted longer than expected, weeks when clouds blocked even faint twilight, moments when food stores seemed thinner than comfort allowed. In those times, patience was tested, but generational memory provided reassurance. This has happened before. Last winter passed, the sun returned then. It will return again. Faith, as we have seen, reinforced this mental resilience. The belief in cycles, whether theological or natural, framed darkness as temporary, not permanent. Even pre-Christian Norse cosmology revolved around cycles of destruction and renewal. Winter did not signal finality. It signaled passage. Children raised in the far north learned early that winter was long, but not endless. Expectations shaped emotional endurance. Modern observers might wonder about seasonal depression, and surely, some individuals struggled more than others. There's no reason to imagine medieval communities were immune to melancholy, but they possessed protective factors modern life often lacks. Constant social contact, shared labor, clear seasonal purpose, minimal artificial overstay. Darkness was not contrasted by bright screens or electric cities. It was natural, familiar, and anticipated. The body may have grown more tired, the mood more subdued, but subdued did not mean defeated. There is a quiet psychological strength that develops in those accustomed to seasonal extremes. Acceptance reduces resistance. Instead of fighting the darkness emotionally, medieval northerners folded into it. Even language may have softened during winter. Conversations slower, movements deliberate. There is evidence in many Arctic cultures of winter as contemplative season, less outward ambition, more inward focus. Long nights encourage reflection. Without fields to tend or ships to sail far from shore, the mind turns inward. Elders recall earlier years. Adults reconsider choices. Young people imagine futures beyond fjords. Darkness becomes mirror, and in that reflection, community matters more than ever. Laughter in winter longhouses carried warmth disproportionate to its volume. A shared joke could lighten a heavy day. Music lifted mood gently. Even simple, rhythmic tapping or humming created shared vibration. Food, though limited, was eaten together. Meals became punctuation marks in dim days. Perhaps most importantly, winter was expected. There's immense psychological difference between unexpected catastrophe and predictable hardship. The polar night arrived every year. It did not surprise. It did not betray. It followed pattern. Expectation shapes resilience, and then there were the stars. On clear nights, when clouds parted and aurora shimmered above mountains, stepping outside could reset perspective entirely. The sky in Arctic winter is immense and brilliant. Constellations blaze sharply. The Milky Way arcs clearly overhead. In such moments, a person standing in snow might feel both small and connected, part of something vast yet ordered. Darkness, then, was not emptiness. It was fullness without glare. Sleep, too, found new rhythm. Some medieval societies practiced segmented sleep, resting for several hours, waking briefly, then sleeping again. In polar night, such patterns may have aligned naturally with extended darkness. Without rigid industrial schedules, flexibility allowed bodies to adjust gradually. If someone woke in middle of the night, they might stir embers, whisper briefly, then return to rest. The absence of sunrise did not dictate panic. It invited adaptation. The mind, like the body, learned to move with season. When frustration arose, and surely it did, it was shared, rarely hidden behind solitary walls. A complaint voiced near the hearth could be met with reassurance. We have done this before. Only some weeks more. Wait until the first light returns. The promise of return is powerful medicine, because in medieval northern Norway, every Jon, Kanayu, with certainty that the sun would come back Italoizad. So through weeks of polar night, the mind bent but did not break. It slowed. It quieted. It endured. Darkness pressed against timber walls. But inside, within shared warmth and steady routine, resilience held firm, and somewhere beyond the horizon, unseen but trusted, the sun continued its path, waiting. Imagine a world cloaked in darkness, not for a night, but for months on end. This was the reality for the people of medieval northern Norway, a time and place where the world was literally divided into light and shadow. Today, we journey back in time to experience one of the most profound and dramatic events of their year, the return of the sun after the long polar night. Life in the high north during the Middle Ages was a constant battle against the elements. Communities were small, isolated pockets of humanity clinging to the rugged coastline, surrounded by unforgiving mountains and the vast, icy sea. Their lives were governed not by clocks or calendars as we know them, but by the eternal rhythm of the seasons, and no season was more extreme than winter. As autumn faded, the days grew shorter with alarming speed. The sun, a familiar friend, would dip lower and lower on the horizon each day, its golden rays turning to a pale, fleeting glow. Then, one day, it wouldn't rise at all. It would skim the edge of the world and disappear, plunging the land into a twilight that would last for months. This was the beginning of the polar night, or mørketid, a dark time. For us, it's hard to truly grasp what this felt like. It wasn't just physical darkness, it was a profound, psychological challenge. The only light came from the moon, the stars, the ethereal dance of the aurora borealis, and the flickering flames of their own hearths and fish oil lamps. Every venture outside the longhouse was a calculated risk. The cold was a physical enemy, biting and relentless, capable of freezing a person in minutes. The darkness concealed dangers, treacherous ice, hidden crevasses, and perhaps, in the deep forests, predators. Inside their sturdy turf and timber longhouses, life turned inward. The community huddled together for warmth and safety. This was a time for mending nets, carving wood, and weaving wool. It was a time for stories. With the wind howling outside, the elders would recount the great sagas of heroes and gods, tales of Odin, Thor and the mischievous Loki. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were a lifeline. They were history, morality lessons, and a way to pass the endless hours, binding the community together with shared culture and memory. They reinforced the idea that even in the deepest darkness, courage and wisdom could prevail. But the darkness took its toll. Without the sun, the body's natural rhythms were disrupted. A deep, pervasive weariness could set in, a condition we might now recognize as seasonal affective disorder. People grew pale. Their energy waned. There was a constant, gnawing anxiety about survival. Would the food stores last? Would the livestock make it through to the spring? The fear of the unknown, of what lurked in the perpetual twilight, was ever present. Folk tales from this era are filled with trolls and malevolent spirits, creatures of the dark that embodied these fears. Yet, even in this deep winter, life had its own quiet beauty. The snow-covered landscape, bathed in the soft blue light of the twilight or the green glow of the northern lights, had a stark, otherworldly magic. The silence of the frozen world was absolute, broken only by the crack of ice or the cry of a seabird. There was a deep sense of peace and stillness that came with this enforced hibernation. Then, after what felt like an eternity, a change would begin. It started subtly, a faint lightening on the southern horizon, a hint of color where there had only been gray and black. It would last for just a few minutes each day, but it was enough. Hope, a fragile seedling, began to sprout. The people would climb to the highest nearby hill, their eyes fixed on that southern glow. Day by day, it grew stronger, brighter. The sky would blush with pinks and oranges, a promise of the fire to come. The anticipation in the village would be electric. Children who had been born in the darkness would hear tales of the Daystar, a giant ball of fire that brought warmth and life. They could hardly imagine it. The adults, who knew its warmth, yearned for it like a long-lost love. This wasn't just about light. It was about life itself. The sun meant the ice would thaw. The fish would return in great numbers. and the first green shoots would eventually break through the snow. It meant survival. And then the day would arrive. The day of the sun's return. Sotogon, everyone in the community, wrapped in their thickest furs and woolens, would gather at a special vantage point, a place with an unobscured view to the south. The air would be still, the silence filled with a palpable tension. All eyes were on the horizon. First, a piercing point of light, impossibly bright, would crest the distant mountains. Gasps and cries of joy would ripple through the crowd. People would point, their faces, pale from the long winter, suddenly illuminated. For the first time in months, they would see each other's faces clearly in natural light, not by the flickering, shadowy glow of a fire. The sun, a sliver at first, then a growing arc of pure, brilliant gold, would climb into the sky. It wouldn't rise high, perhaps only clearing the horizon for a few precious minutes before beginning its descent again. But it was there. It was real. Its rays, though still weak, carried a promise of warmth on the frozen air. People would turn their faces towards it, closing their eyes, feeling that faint touch on their skin. It was a physical, spiritual, and emotional reunion. This moment was a powerful symbol of renewal, of resurrection. It was the victory of light over darkness, of life over the long, cold death of winter. The return of the sun wasn't just an astronomical event. It was a deeply spiritual and communal celebration. It reaffirmed their place in the world and their connection to the powerful cycles of nature. It was a reminder that no matter how long or how deep the darkness, the light will always return. Following this first glimpse, there would be feasting and celebration. The best of their preserved foods would be brought out. It was a festival of hope, a thanksgiving for surviving the dark time. The sagas told on this night would not be of ghosts and trolls, but of creation, of beginnings, and of the power of the sun, personified as the goddess Esel, riding her chariot across the sky. From that day forward, the light would grow stronger. Each day the sun would climb higher and stay for longer. The world would slowly reawaken. The ice would begin to crack, the snow would melt, and the land, so long dormant, would prepare for the explosive, vibrant life of the Arctic summer. The long night was over. Life had won. Thinking about their experience puts our own lives into perspective. We live in a world saturated with artificial light, where true darkness is rare. But for the people of medieval Norway, the return of the sun was the most important event of the year, a dramatic and beautiful testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the profound power of light. Have you ever wondered what it was like to survive a long, dark winter in the Middle Ages, way up north in Norway? Imagine months of near-total darkness, biting winds, and a landscape buried under snow and ice. The world would feel small, confined to the flickering warmth of a longhouse fire. But then, something magical happens. The sun, a long-lost friend, begins to climb higher in the sky each day. This wasn't just a change of season. For the Norse people living 1,000 years ago, it was a rebirth. This was the arrival of spring, a time of immense relief, hard work, and joyous celebration. Today, we're journeying back in time to experience the raw, powerful, and beautiful reality of spring in medieval northern Norway. The first sign of spring wasn't a gentle breeze or a blooming flower. It was the sound of dripping water. The relentless drip, drip, drip of melting icicles hanging from the turf roofs of their longhouses was the first music of the new season. The snow, which had been a thick, insulating blanket, would begin to recede, revealing the hard, frozen ground beneath. The air, once sharp enough to sting your lungs, would soften. You could smell it, a damp, earthy scent, replacing the sterile cold of winter. For people who had been cooped up for months, these first signs were electrifying. It meant the world was opening up again. As the days grew longer, the ice that had locked the fjords and coastlines began to break apart. This was a momentous event. The cracking and groaning of the ice sheets was a powerful, sometimes deafening, chorus announcing that the sea was free. For a society so deeply connected to the ocean, this was everything. It meant the return of the fishing boats. Winter stores of dried fish and salted meat were likely running dangerously low. The first successful fishing trips of spring weren't just about food. They were about survival. Men would eagerly mend their nets, patch up their boats, the nares, and longships, and prepare for the bounty of the sea. Cod, herring, and other fish would start their migrations, and the promise of fresh food was a powerful motivator. The sea was their larder, and its reopening meant the end of winter's lean times. Back on land, the landscape underwent a dramatic transformation. The retreating snow revealed a world that was brown and gray at first, but soon patches of green would appear with astonishing speed. Hardy mosas, lichens, and resilient grasses were the first to reclaim the land. Small, tough flowers like the purple saxifrage would burst through the thawing soil, adding vibrant splashes of color to the muted landscape. This wasn't the lush, gentle spring you might imagine further south. It was a rugged, determined greening of the land. It also meant the return of another crucial food source. Foraging. People, especially women and children, would scour the newly accessible ground for edible plants, roots, and early berries. Every leaf and shoot was a welcome addition to the diet, providing much-needed vitamins after a long winter. And what about the animals? The farm animals, like sheep and cattle, that had been kept inside the longhouse or in adjacent shelters all winter, could finally be let out to pasture. Imagine the scene. The doors are opened, and the animals, weak and shaggy from their long confinement, blink in the bright sunlight before eagerly seeking out the first green shoots. This was a critical moment for the farm's health. It also meant a lot of work. Fences needed to be repaired, and the animals had to be watched carefully as they roamed. The manure that had accumulated in their winter quarters was a valuable resource. It was painstakingly collected and spread over the small fields to fertilize the soil for the coming planting season. Farming in northern Norway was a challenge, even in the best of times. The growing season was short, and the soil was often thin. Spring was a frantic race against time. As soon as the ground was workable, the fields had to be plowed. This was back-breaking labor. The yard, a simple scratch plow, likely pulled by an ox or even by the people themselves, was used to break up the soil. Then came planting. Barley and oats were the most common crops, as they were hardy enough to survive the short northern summer. Every single grain was precious. A successful harvest in the autumn depended entirely on the hard work put in during these few crucial weeks of spring. A late frost or a bad storm could be disastrous, but spring wasn't all work and no play. The return of the light and warmth brought a profound sense of joy and community. After months of isolation, people would gather. One of the most important spring celebrations was fjords, or the spring sacrifice. This was a pagan festival, and though Christianity was gradually taking hold, these old traditions remained deeply ingrained in the culture. The VRBLT was a way to thank the gods, Freya for fertility or Thor for protection for surviving the winter, and to ask for their blessing for the coming season. This would involve a feast, with the first fresh foods of the year being shared among the community. There would be storytelling, music, and games. It was a time to reconnect to Serenus, and to strengthen the bonds that were so essential for survival in this harsh environment. The longer days also meant the return of travel and trade. With the seas open and the mountain passes becoming clear of snow, long-distance journeys were possible again. Traders would arrive in their ships, bringing goods from the south, perhaps grains, honey, or iron tools. In return, the northern communities would offer their own unique products. Valuable furs from animals trapped during the winter, walrus, ivory, and of course, dried fish, which was a major export. These interactions connected the remote communities of northern Norway to the wider medieval world. It was a time of opportunity, a chance to acquire goods that couldn't be produced locally and to hear news from distant lands. We also can't forget the symbolic power of the sun. In a land that experienced a polar night, the sun's return was deeply spiritual. The Norse people had a rich mythology filled with stories about the sun and moon. The sun was personified as the goddess Isel, chased across the sky by a wolf. Her daily victory over the darkness of night, growing stronger and longer each day in spring, would have been a powerful daily reminder of the triumph of life over death, light over darkness. This wasn't just an astronomical event. It was a core part of their worldview, a drama played out in the heavens that mirrored their own struggle and survival on Earth. So, as we look back at spring in medieval northern Norway, we see a picture of incredible resilience. It was a season of immense labor on the sea, into fields, and around the homestead. But it was also a season of profound relief, joy, and celebration. It was the time when the world woke up, when the community came back to life, and when the promise of the future was renewed. Surviving the northern winter was a testament to their strength and ingenuity. But it was in the spring that you can truly see the vibrant, determined spirit of the Norse people. They didn't just endure the harshness of their world. They embraced its cycles and found ways to thrive within it, celebrating the return of the sun with every fiber of their being. If the polar night feels like the world holding its breath, the midnight sun feels like exhaling all at once. In medieval northern Norway, above the Arctic Circle, the return of spring does not stop at balance. The sun does not simply resume normal rhythm. It continues climbing, higher, longer, stronger, until one day, it no longer sets at all. At first, it happens gradually. Evening lingers, later than expected. Dusk stretches into what should be night. The horizon glows long after the usual hour of rest. Then, in early summer, the sun dips low toward the horizon, but never fully disappears. It skims the edge of the world and rises again. Midnight arrives, and it is bright. After months of darkness, this reversal is astonishing. The land that endured endless shadow now basks in unbroken light. For medieval communities, this season carried both opportunity and challenge. Light meant work, and in the far north, the growing season was short. Fields had to be sown and tended quickly. Barley and oats required careful timing. Livestock grazed in higher pastures, when snow retreated fully. Fishing intensified. With open seas and constant visibility, boats could venture farther and longer. Nets were cast at hours that would once have been night. Though now the concept of night blurred, men rode beneath a sun suspended just above fjord waters at midnight. Its golden reflection shimmered across still surface. Sleep required discipline. Without darkness as signal, the body could remain alert far past natural limits. Medieval people did not possess blackout curtains or artificial night. They relied on routine and habit. Doors were closed deliberately, lamps extinguished intentionally. Families chose rest even when the sky remained bright. Children, energized by endless daylight, required guidance to settle. The contrast from winter is dramatic. In polar night, activity contracted inward. In midnight sun, life expanded outward. Where once hearth was center, now the open landscape reclaimed attention. Mountains, revealed fully, glowed in long golden light. Fjords sparkled beneath constant sun. Forest edges shimmered in breeze. Sound increased. Birdsong grew lively and persistent. Livestock moved energetically. Boats creaked against docks. Tools struck wood and stone in steady rhythm. Work accelerated. There was urgency in this brightness, but different from autumn urgency. Autumn prepared for survival. Summer built abundance. Fishing racks once again filled with drying cod. Fields rippled faintly under persistent light. Children carried water from streams that now ran clear and strong from snowmelt. Travel between settlements became easier and more frequent. Paths dried. Passes opened. Markets flourished in coastal towns. In regions like Tromsø, though smaller and less developed in medieval times than today, seasonal gatherings would have increased as navigation improved. Trade routes along the Norwegian coast connected north to south. Dried fish traveled outward. Grain and goods returned. The midnight sun made such movements safer and longer lasting. But constant light also required adaptation. Human bodies evolve with day-night rhythm. In a land where night does not fall for weeks, people learned to impose boundaries. Work could continue endlessly, but exhaustion followed if unchecked. So routines were kept deliberately. Meals marked time. Bells in churches still rang according to schedule, reminding communities of structure beyond sky. The symbolism of this season was powerful. After enduring months where the sun never rose, now there were weeks when it never set. Darkness and light were not opposites here. They were partners in an extreme dance. Standing beside a fjord at midnight in high summer, one might see the sun hovering low, golden, gentle, but unmistakably present. Shadows stretch long but never vanish entirely. The air holds warmth rare in northern climate. It feels abundant. Medieval Norwegians understood this abundance was temporary. Winter would return, but now was time to gather. Fields were weeded carefully. Fences reinforced, boats loaded heavily. Fish dried in large quantities. Children learned swimming in icy but navigable waters. Young adults courted in extended evenings, where darkness never offered privacy, but light offered possibility. Community life thrived outdoors. Where winter gathered families tightly indoors, summer dispersed them across landscape, yet with renewed connection. Even spiritual life adjusted. Church services held in bright hours carried different tone. Candlelight felt symbolic rather than necessary. Faith in summer reflected gratitude rather than endurance. The midnight sun could feel almost surreal after polar night. Imagine someone who endured months of dim twilight now standing beneath a sky that refuses to darken. The mind recalibrates again. Hope in winter was quiet. Joy in summer was visible. And yet, wise communities did not forget the cycle. They worked while light allowed it, because above the Arctic Circle, extremes are never permanent. Midnight sun does not last forever. Soon, its arc lowers. Evening returns. Night begins to lengthen again, but for these weeks, the land basks fully. Fjords gleam, mountains glow, fields stretch green where snow once lay deep. The same houses that held families through endless night now open wide to sun that will not set. And in that contrast, from shadow to radiance, medieval northern Norway reveals its rhythm. Endure the dark, work in the light. Prepare for the turn. The midnight sun is not merely spectacle. It is reward. It is urgency. It is promise renewed before the cycle begins again. In medieval northern Norway, life was not divided simply into seasons. It was divided into extremes. Months when the sun did not rise. Weeks when it did not set. Between these poles lay everything: work, faith, hunger, story, endurance, renewal. To live above the Arctic Circle was to surrender the illusion of balance. Nature here did not offer moderation. It offered rhythm. The people who lived along fjords and beneath mountains near places we now call Tromsø did not attempt to control this rhythm. They aligned with it. When the sun vanished in late autumn, they did not curse the sky day. Preparted. When darkness stretched across weeks, they did not abandon hope. They tended fire. When the first sliver of light returned, they did not assume winter was gone. They worked, and when the midnight sun bathed the land in gold, they did not grow careless. They gathered for the future. This is the quiet wisdom of the North. Extremes teach discipline. In milder climates, change can be gradual. In northern Norway, change is undeniable. You feel it in your bones. You see it in the arc of the sun. You'll hear it in the shift of wind. Darkness is not metaphor here. It is physical. Light is not poetic. It is survival. And so, medieval communities built lives shaped by certainty of return. They knew winter would come again. They knew summer would follow. There was no permanent victory over hardship, only participation in cycle. That cycle shaped architecture. Houses built low and strong, ready for months of enclosure. It shaped labor. Autumn urgency. Winter, steadiness. Spring repair. Summer, abundance. It shaped belief. Light overcoming darkness was not abstract theology. It was yearly experience. It shaped the mind. Patience replaced panic. Acceptance replaced resistance. To endure a polar night without losing hope requires trust. Not blind optimism, but memory-based trust. The sun has always returned. It will return again. Imagine standing on a ridge above a fjord in late summer. The midnight sun lingers lower now, dipping slightly closer to horizon each evening. You know what comes next. Days will shorten. The air will cool. Shadows will lengthen. But you do not fear it, because you have walked this path before. In medieval northern Norway, children grew up with this understanding woven into daily life. They did not experience winter as anomaly. They experienced it as chapter and chapter's end. The endless night was never truly endless. The endless day was never permanent. Both were phases. Both were teachers. The long night taught closeness to family, to fire, to story. The midnight sun taught expansion to sea, to field, to trade. The two were not enemies. They were partners in shaping resilience. Modern observers might look at polar night and see hardship alone, but for those who lived within it, it was familiar terrain. It slowed life, it deepened listening. It sharpened awareness of warmth and human presence. And when the sun returned, joy was not casual. It was earned. In the same way, the midnight sun's brilliance carried awareness of coming shadow. Gratitude tempered excess. This balance, not of daylight hours, but of attitude, defined medieval life in the far north. The land did not promise ease. It promised rhythm. Fjords froze and thawed. Mountains darkened and gleamed. Fields slept and sprouted. Fire died down and was rekindled. Children grew in. Elders' passé stories continued. Generation after generation learned to measure life, not in unbroken brightness, but in faithful return. Perhaps that is the deeper lesson of living through endless night. Darkness is not absence of life. It is part of its structure, and light, when it comes, feels more vivid because of what preceded it. As autumn approaches once more and the sun begins its gradual descent toward the horizon, medieval northern families do not dread the coming dark. They begin again. Wood is cut. Fish are dried. Wool is spun. The house is prepared. The hearth is checked. And somewhere in the memory of every adult stands the image of that first sunrise after winter. Proof that patience bears fruit. The cycle that never ends is not a trap. It is continuity. In the far north of medieval Norway, beneath mountains and beside deep fjords, people did not conquer the endless night. They lived through it. They shaped themselves around it. And in doing so, they became something enduring, steady as timber beams, persistent as embers beneath ash. The sun sets, the sun rises. The night stretches. The light returns. Again, and again, and again. Imagine a place where the sun disappears and then returns. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but faithfully. In the far north of medieval Norway, life was not measured by clocks or calendars. It was measured by light, by the first morning when the sun failed to rise, by the quiet weeks of twilight at noon, by the steady glow of a hearth in a timber house, by the moment a golden edge crested the mountains once more. They did not conquer the darkness. They endured it. They did not demand balance from the sky. They adapted to its extremes. When the forest fell silent beneath snow, they turned inward. When fjords froze and wind sharpened, they gathered closer. When oil lamps flickered against timber walls, they told stories. When faith felt heavier than daylight, they held it carefully. And when the sun returned brief at first, Tenstringir, they stepped outside and lifted their faces toward it, not in surprise, but in recognition, because in this land, above the Arctic Circle, darkness was never permanent. It was passage. The hearth burned when the sun would not. The nets were mended while mountains stood in shadow. The wool was spun while stars ruled the sky. They trusted the cycle, and the cycle held them. Today, we live with light at the press of a switch. We feel night with brightness so easily that we rarely sit with true darkness. But once, in medieval Norway, people knew the weight of it. They knew the silence of snow beneath starlight, the breath of wind across frozen fjords, the sound of embers shifting in the hearth at midnight. And take now, with quiet certainty, that somewhere beyond the horizon, the sun was still moving, waiting for its return. The endless nights shaped them. It slove, it deepened them. It taught them patience, and when the midnight sun refused to set, it reminded them of abundance, fleeting, brilliant, and to be used wisely. This was not a land of ease. It was a land of rhythm, darkness and light, silence and sound, stillness and motion. Again, and again, and again, As we leave this world of fjords and firelight, imagine the final image. A longhouse stands against the northern sky. Snow gathers on its roof. Smoke rises gently from the vent. Inside, a hearth glows. Outside, the sky is dark, but not empty. And beyond the mountains, just out of sight, the sun continues its path, waiting to rise. And so, the long night gives way to light once more. Thank you for spending this time in medieval Norway with me, for listening, reflecting, and walking through the endless night together. If you found this story meaningful, and you're not yet subscribed, I warmly invite you to join us. There are many more quiet journeys into history waiting ahead. Until next time, rest well.